Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Sabres, in which the Sabres managed to win 3-2 in overtime. This game started off rather close. The San Jose Sharks were not going to make the same mistake twice as they did against the Vegas Golden Knights and sort of playing such an openly defensive game, luckily. And so in the first period, there was maybe one chance for the Sharks, which was that Sorensen opportunity, maybe a couple okay chances for the Sabres, but really not much doing. It came in the second period when the Sabres managed to get a couple of goals, or I think it was only one goal in that second. The other one came somewhat early in the third period. Ristolainen got a goal off of a very nice move that caught Brent Burns. It's definitely a bit flat-footed, as well as Nathan Beaulieu sort of on a cross-ice pass, so you can't really blame Martin Jones for that one. The Sharks managed to storm back in a game that it didn't look like it was going to happen with how somewhat unmotivated the Sharks did look, but it was Joe Pavelski, the captain, getting his 14th and 15th of the year, one of them being on the power play, to bring the Sharks back into this game, tied at 2 and force the overtime against the Sabres team, who was looking for their 10th win in a row. The Sabres, who definitely are used to playing in the overtime and in the shootout, especially during this streak where I think in the first 9 games and now in the 10 games they've gone to the past 60 minutes 7 times, managed to get the game winner. It was Jeff Skinner with his 19th of the year to win it for the Sabres and give them that historic 10-game winning streak. The Sharks did end up with a point, which is nice, but will end up moving on to Toronto tomorrow with the loss. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the Eastern Conference games. The San Jose Sharks have now played 12 on the season at this point, and their record at the moment sits 4-4-4. So I guess if you want to look at it in a more of a pessimistic way, that is 4-8. And it just seems like during these Eastern Conference games, the San Jose Sharks fail to really get that motivation, to get that drive. They don't really look like they're trying all too hard out there. I mean, you look at some of the wins that they did have. Obviously, the 8-2 win against the Philadelphia Flyers stands out as a big win. They had a couple of nice wins against the Islanders and the Sabres 5-1. But other than that, many overtime losses that could have been avoided, many losses that it just looked like the Sharks were unmotivated. And tonight, for the majority of this game, I guess except Joe Pavelski, the Sharks really just couldn't get much going in it. And so the Sharks, in my opinion, sort of stole a point from this one, from the Sabres under their nose. And so hopefully with the last 3 games of this road trip being against Eastern Conference teams, the Sharks can actually find some motivation to play a much more driven type of game, because it just really hasn't been the case against most of the Eastern Conference teams during the first 25 games of this season. Next is Martin Jones, and I didn't think I was going to be saying too much negative, even if the Sabres were going to win this game in the overtime, because I thought Jones actually played a rather solid game. You know, I can't really blame him for the Ristolainen one. It was a fantastic move. Definitely can't blame him for the Nathan Beaulieu one. But it really came down to this Jeff Skinner goal. Jones does a very aggressive play that we don't normally see from Martin Jones. It's normally like, I wouldn't have been surprised if Aaron Dell would have pulled something like that, because he's definitely the more aggressive goaltender when it comes to playing the puck, but it's rare to see Martin Jones, and the reason it's rare to see Martin Jones make a play like that is because he's not really the best at handling the puck. We saw that earlier in this game a couple times when he comes from behind the net. He has a tendency to sometimes give it away, and this time he pushes forward. Hertl-Karlsson certainly not expecting that while being tied up with Rasmus Dahlin, the rookie sensation, or whatever. And so it ends up poking away to Jeff Skinner, who's basically in all alone, as Hertl-Karlsson is, of course, tied up by Dahlin. And you give someone who's tied for the league lead in goals and ended up being the league lead in goals. I think he has his 19th. This might have been his 18th. I'm not 100% sure. But he's going to, more likely than not, punish your goaltender. And that's exactly what happens to Martin Jones. And so you could technically say that this game ends on a Martin Jones misplay. But realistically, he was actually quite solid for the majority of this game. Next is the first line, and the first line is, of course, if you can see, Hertl-Couture and Timo Meier. And of course, it was maybe just a few weeks ago where I was saying that this was a first line that needed to stick together. They were playing so well together. So many of the Sharks' goals were coming through these 3 players. They were involved in almost every single one up to a certain point, through the first, 15 or so games of the season. That has certainly come to a grinding halt. Logan Couture, Timo Meier, and Tomas Hertl don't seem to have that same chemistry that they had. Earlier on in the season, yes, they were getting some great bounces that were allowing them to score a lot more goals than maybe you'd expect, and so you were certainly seeing that they would be able to come back down to earth. But it really did look like there were some promising aspects to the game that they did have that would make it seem like it would not remain as great, but still remain somewhat sustainable. But that hasn't really occurred in these past few games. and they seem to be caught on the ice a lot for goals against 5-on-5. Of course, they do play against the top competition on the other team more often than not, yet, but still, you want your first line to be one of the better first lines of the league, and we saw later on in this game, Timo Meier was moved down to the Thornton line with Thornton and Sorensen, and Labanc was actually moved up to the Couture-Hertl line. De Boer trying to spark something in this game. It didn't end up happening, as it was Joe Pavelski, the line that wasn't touched, that ended up getting both goals, including one on the power play. But it'll be interesting to see what De Boer does moving forward into the next game, to see if he just gives a bit more time for Hertl and Couture-Meier to find back some consistency that will allow them to put the puck into the net, or if he does actually go for the radical change of putting Labanc onto that first line and moving Meier with Thornton and Sorensen, because Meier, Thornton, and Sorensen actually looked pretty solid during that third period, although I think maybe it's just that the Thornton-Sorensen chemistry continued to be quite strong in this game. Finally, a few other notes about this game. Radil came back in for Antti Suomela. Again, not much of an impact. The fourth line for the San Jose Sharks during the majority of the season just really hasn't done much at all. I mean, Barclay Goodrow's main points have come on that one game against the Wild when he was on the third line, as well as shorthanded. Melker Karlsson did get his first goal of the season against the Vancouver Canucks, but the first goal of the season, only second point of the season. Radil doesn't have a point yet. And so right now the fourth line for the San Jose Sharks is mostly non-existent, which isn't a great thing going forward for the Sharks. They really need to find something to work on that fourth line. But at the moment, it seems as though De Boer has his hands sort of figuratively tied up because of the fact that the penalty kill has been so good that he doesn't really want to bench Karlsson or Goodrow, even though they're somewhat offensive black holes, you could call them, but they are somewhat strong on the penalty kill. Suomela, again, was scratched this game. I hope that he'll make it back in for the next one. It's not like Radil was any sort of impact in this game, and as I said, Suomela can at least give some sort of offensive impact onto this line, possibly, because he does have more offensive instincts than Radil. But I guess if you wanted to go a bit more defensive, it seems as though De Boer might have a bit more faith in Radil. I'm not 100% sure about that, whether or not we haven't really seen enough of number 52 to really make a guess like that. But I guess that seems to be the logic that De Boer likes to use. Erik Karlsson had a pretty solid game. I didn't like his overtime. I thought his overtime was pretty poor, and actually I'll transition that to talking about the overtime. The San Jose Sharks in the past few overtimes that they've played hasn't looked that great. It seems as though they can't really find the correct combination of three players to put onto the ice, and they put on Joe Thornton for this one. I never recommend at this point to put on Joe Thornton in the overtime. We saw he basically took a hooking penalty against Jeff Skinner. I don't believe it actually ended up getting called, but it definitely looked like hooking to me. Luckily it wasn't called, although the Sabres still end up scoring about 5 seconds later. But I'm not sure why you're putting Joe Thornton on in the overtime. He's just too slow of a player. Yes, if you get in the offensive zone, he can make something happen, but it's just so risky to do that. I feel like Joe Thornton, even though he was having a decent game offensively, should probably just ride the bench for the full 5 minutes. But it seems like the Sharks are having some issues finding the perfect three-man unit to put together. You look at some of the other teams in the league thus far, especially, the Oilers, who we just faced last week, have basically their staple three-man unit to put onto the ice. The Sharks don't really have that yet, and it'll be interesting to see if they do find it, because while the Sharks do earn a point in this game, by the end of the season, you're going to be looking back at some of the overtime losses that the Sharks have, and those missed opportunities, those missed points, could end up mattering in the standings. As I sort of transitioned away from Karlsson's game, but otherwise, besides the overtime, I thought Karlsson was rather solid. Besides one major giveaway, he continues to be quite good for the San Jose Sharks, and so I continue to talk about him because it's obviously the biggest storyline for the Sharks so far this season. Otherwise, I thought Brent Burns wasn't great in this game. I thought he had a couple of okay offensive opportunities, but I feel like he just wasn't getting much done in this game, and his defense did leave a bit to be desired. But that will do it for this review. The San Jose Sharks will be back in action once again tomorrow for a back-to-back. It'll seem as though since Jones started tonight against the Buffalo Sabres, Dell will get the very difficult assignment of starting against the Toronto Maple Leafs tomorrow, and it's possible that Austin Matthews will actually return from injury in that game, at which point it'll be an even more difficult assignment for Aaron Dell. We'll see how he steps up to the plate, because the San Jose Sharks, now 0-1-1 on this road trip, will look to at least make it 1-1-1 and try and get, the first win on it. Class dismissed.